At my sister-in-law's wedding, she screamed that her $1 million diamond ring was missing and pointed straight at me. Before 200 guests, she and my mother-in-law lunged forward and tore at my dress while my husband watched in silence. The microphone shrieked with feedback before Chloe's voice cut through it. "Thief!" 200 faces turned. All of them landed on me. I was standing by the champagne tower, one hand resting on the curve of my belly, 8 months along, in a dress I'd had tailored twice because I kept growing out of the first fitting. My other hand was still holding a glass of sparkling cider, the only thing I'd been allowed to toast with all night, and it was shaking so hard the bubbles climbed up and over the rim before I even understood what was happening. Chloe stood on the small platform where the DJ had set up, her wedding gown catching the light from the chandelier, the microphone gripped in her fist like a weapon. She was pointing directly at me. "She stole my ring," she said, louder this time, projecting it to the back corners of the ballroom like she'd rehearsed it. "My $1 million ring." I looked at my husband. Dominic was 11 feet away, standing near the head table, and he said nothing. He looked at the floor, not at me, not at his sister, at the floor, like it might open up and swallow the moment before he had to choose a side. I want to tell you I had some kind of clever response ready. I didn't. I had 8 months of practice staying quiet, and in the one moment that quiet could have cost me everything, my body defaulted to the only setting it knew. Chloe had hated me since the day Dominic brought me home 3 years earlier. Not a slow-building dislike. Instant, total, and permanent. The way some people decide about a restaurant from the smell in the doorway. My clothes were too simple, which meant I was poor. My quietness read as stupid to a family that mistook volume for intelligence. And when I didn't talk about my own family, Chloe decided that meant I didn't have one worth mentioning. Her mother, Eleanor, agreed with every word of it and did so publicly, repeatedly, for 3 years. At holiday dinners. In family photos where I'd somehow ended up cropped out of the final print more than once, always by accident, always apologized for with the same tight smile. Eleanor liked to tell her friends, within earshot of me, that her son had married beneath him. She said it the way other people mention the weather. I stayed quiet through all of it because Dominic had asked me to, gently, in the reasonable voice he used when he wanted something without having to demand it. "Just get through the wedding season," he'd said. "Once the baby comes, I'll set boundaries. I promise." I believed him. That's the part that still embarrasses me more than the torn dress does. There'd been 100 small moments before that night that I could point to now and say, there, that was the warning. Christmas 2 years ago, when Eleanor sat me at the far end of the table near the kitchen door. "So you'd be closer to the food if the baby," except there was no baby yet, and everyone at that table knew it, and the sentence trailed off into nothing, because even Eleanor understood it didn't make sense. Chloe's engagement party, where she'd handed me a place card that read simply, "Dominic's wife," while everyone else's cards had their actual names printed in gold script. I'd laughed it off in the moment, the way you do, telling myself it was carelessness rather than a message. I told myself a lot of things over 3 years, that Eleanor's comments were generational, not personal, that Chloe was protective of her brother in a way that would soften once she got to know me, that the cropped photos were bad luck, bad angles, bad timing. Never once, until that night, did I let myself add them up into a pattern, because doing the math meant admitting I'd married into a family that had decided who I was before I'd said a single word to any of them. Dominic saw some of it. He had to have. He was in the room for the seating chart, for the engagement party, for at least 2 of the 4 photos I noticed I wasn't in. Every time, his response was some version of the same sentence. "That's just how they are. It'll get better. Don't make a thing of it." I'd internalized his conflict avoidance so thoroughly that by the night of the wedding, "Don't make a thing of it" was already running in my head before Chloe had even finished her first sentence into that microphone. "Prove you didn't take it," Chloe snapped into the microphone, stepping down off the platform and closing the distance between us in her jeweled gown, heels clicking against the parquet floor like a countdown. "I didn't take your ring, Chloe." "Then prove it." Before I could say anything else, she grabbed my sleeve. Eleanor came from the other side and grabbed the back of my dress at the same time, like they'd choreographed it, like this had been discussed somewhere I hadn't been invited. They pulled. Fabric ripped from my shoulder to my waist, a sound I felt more than heard, a kind of tearing that went straight through my chest. Someone in the crowd gasped. A camera flashed, an actual camera, from a guest, the kind of reflexive photo taking that happens before anyone processes what they're witnessing. My silk lining stayed in place, thank God, but the outer layer of the dress hung open at my side, and I stood there in front of 200 people feeling exactly as exposed as Chloe had intended. A pregnant woman, half-dressed, nowhere to hide, and no one moving to help me hide. I looked at Dominic again. His jaw was tight, a muscle working in his cheek, and for 1 second I thought he might finally do something. "Say something," I whispered, though the room was so silent he probably heard it from 11 feet away. "Just let them check your things," he said. "We'll fix this later." That sentence ended our marriage before either of us said the word divorce. I didn't know it yet, not in any way I could have explained, but some part of me filed it away as the moment the last excuse I'd been making for him ran out. Chloe dumped my purse onto the floor. Lipstick rolled under a chair. My keys skidded across the parquet. A bottle of prenatal vitamins landed on its side and spun once before stopping. No ring. "She hid it somewhere," Chloe said, scanning the crowd like the ring might materialize out of pure accusation. I noticed things in that moment that I wouldn't fully fully understand until later. The wedding planner, a woman named Priya who'd been organizing the reception all evening with a headset and a clipboard, had gone pale near the gift table. She kept glancing toward Chloe's cousin Amanda, who was clutching a small silver clutch bag against her ribs with both arms, the way you'd hold something you were afraid to drop. I noticed the small red light blinking steadily above the exit doors. Cameras. They'd forgotten about the cameras. I pulled the torn dress closed with one hand and reached into my purse for my phone with the other. My fingers weren't steady, but I found the right contact on the second try. Chloe laughed, a short, ugly sound. Calling the police on your own family? No, I said. I'm calling mine. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who my father is and why I never told the Vance family. My name is Vivian. My maiden name is Sterling. I'd been going by Vivian Vance for 3 years, ever since the wedding. And in all that time, I had let the family believe what they wanted to believe about where I came from, partly because Dominic asked me to keep things simple. His family had opinions about old money versus new money versus whatever category they imagined me in, and I didn't feel like fighting a war I hadn't started, partly because I'd grown up watching my father get treated differently the moment people learned his name, and I wanted, for once in my life, to be liked for reasons that had nothing to do with what he owned. My father is Walter Sterling. He built Sterling Hospitality Group from a single boutique hotel in Savannah into a chain of 31 properties across the Southeast, including the one we were standing in that night, the Ashford Grand, host venue for Chloe's wedding, a building my father had personally overseen the renovation of 11 years earlier. Dominic knew. I told him early on, quietly, and asked him not to make a thing of it. He hadn't. Whether that was respect for my wishes or a strategic decision to keep a card in his pocket, I genuinely don't know anymore. I used to think it was the former. His mother and sister never asked where my money came from because they'd already decided I didn't have any. It's a strange kind of camouflage, being underestimated. People stop looking at you closely once they've already written your story. I'd worked as a hospital social worker for 6 years before the wedding, a detail that turns out to matter more than you'd think, because 6 years of watching families in crisis teaches you to notice small things. Who's lying? Who's covering for someone else? Who's about to fall apart and who's performing falling apart for an audience? Eleanor and Chloe had spent 3 years performing at me. That night, for the first time, I watched them perform for 200 witnesses instead, and something in me went very cold and very clear. My father picked up on the first ring, the way he always did after 9 p.m., when he assumed a call meant something was wrong. Dad. My voice came out steadier than I felt. It's time. There was a pause, maybe 2 full seconds, and I could hear him set something down on the other end. A glass? A folder? I never asked. Stay exactly where you are, sweetheart, he said. Security is already moving. He wasn't just my father. He owned the building I was standing in. I hadn't planned this. I want to be honest about that, because it would make a better story if I'd walked into that wedding with some grand strategy already loaded. But the truth is, I'd spent 3 years hoping I'd never need the option sitting in my back pocket. I only used it because Eleanor, at that exact moment, raised her voice loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear. I'll have her arrested before dessert is served, she announced, to nobody and everybody. Someone find hotel security. Dominic still hadn't said one word in my defense. Not one. I turned my back to Chloe, phone against my ear, and waited. 4 security officers walked into the ballroom within 90 seconds. I found out later that the Ashford Grand kept a dedicated response team on site for exactly this kind of situation. Property disputes, intoxicated guests, the occasional celebrity wedding that drew paparazzi, and that my father had a standing protocol that any call using a specific phrase triggered immediate lockdown procedures. Every ballroom door clicked locked behind them, a soft, final sound. Eleanor smiled when she saw them enter, genuinely delighted. Excellent. Detain that woman. They walked straight past her, straight to me. Mrs. Sterling. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man named Curtis Okafor, who I'd later learn had been the Ashford Grand's head of security for 9 years, addressed me by a name nobody in that room except my father had used in 3 years. Are you hurt? Chloe blinked, the microphone still loose in her other hand. Her name is Vance. My married name, I said. Sterling is the name on the deed to this building. I watched it land across the room in stages, like a wave breaking in slow motion. Priya, the wedding planner's mouth fell open. A cousin near the bar actually laughed before catching himself. Eleanor's smile didn't move for a full 3 seconds, frozen in place like her face hadn't gotten the message yet. A woman in a charcoal suit stepped through the crowd toward me, a tablet under one arm. She draped her own suit jacket over my shoulders before she'd even introduced herself, covering the torn dress without a word, and only then turned to face the room. My name is Fiona Vasquez, she said, chief counsel for Sterling Hospitality Group. She held up the tablet like a gavel. This ballroom has been under full surveillance since the start of the reception. No one leaves. We have evidence of theft and physical assault against a pregnant woman that needs to be preserved before anyone touches anything further. Dominic finally moved, crossing toward me for the first time all night. Vivian, don't make this bigger than it is. I looked at him. Really looked. The way you look at someone when you've just realized you've been looking at a photograph of them instead of the actual person for 3 years. You watched your mother and sister strip a pregnant woman in public, I said. Your wife, and you're worried about the size of it? I was trying to stay calm. No, I said. You were choosing who signs your paycheck. His face went white in a way I'd never seen before, and he didn't ask what I meant. He didn't need to. I'd known for 8 months that Dominic worked in business development for a logistics company called Harlow Freight Solutions, a mid-sized outfit that, on paper, had nothing to do with my father's hotels. What I hadn't said out loud until that second was that I'd known for 4 of those months that Harlow was a vendor contracted to 3 Sterling hospitality properties, handling linen and supply logistics for the Ashford Grand, among others, and that Dominic's entire client relationship, the account he'd built his last performance review around, the one that had gotten him a raise the previous spring, existed because of who I was, not who he was. I'd found out by accident, actually, 4 months earlier, flipping through a folder of vendor contracts my father had left on the kitchen counter during a Sunday visit, the way you notice a familiar name in a place you don't expect it. I hadn't said anything to Dominic. I'd told myself it wasn't relevant, that plenty of people end up doing business with family without it meaning anything sinister. I believed that, mostly, until the moment in the ballroom when his silence in front of his mother suddenly had a much simpler explanation than loyalty or fear. He wasn't just afraid of Eleanor's disapproval. He had a mortgage payment tied to staying on her good side, or close enough to it. He'd built half his career quietly, standing on a foundation he pretended not to know was mine. Fiona tapped the tablet. Behind the head table, the enormous screen that had been playing a slideshow of Chloe and her new husband's engagement photos flickered and cut to black, then to a security feed. A timestamp sat in the corner. 5:42 p.m. 1 hour before the ceremony had even started. The bridal suite. Empty at first, just a rack of dresses and a makeup station under bright vanity bulbs. Then Chloe walked into frame. 200 guests turned toward the screen at the exact same moment. A single motion, like a flock of birds changing direction. "Turn that off," Chloe said. Her voice had gone small, nothing like the amplified command she'd used 10 minutes earlier. Fiona didn't move. "Everyone's going to want to see this part." The video kept rolling. On the screen, Chloe crossed to the vanity, opened a small velvet ring box sitting beside a spray of white orchids, and studied the ring inside for a long moment, turning it under the light, tilting it, the way you'd examine something you were deciding whether to keep or return. Then she closed the box, slid it into the pocket of a garment bag hanging nearby, and walked out of frame. The timestamp kept running. 5:44, 5:45. At 5:51, Amanda, the cousin with the silver clutch, entered the frame, opened the same garment bag, removed the velvet box, and put it into her own purse. The room had gone dead silent, except for the low hum of the projector fan. "That's not," Chloe started, then stopped, because there wasn't an end to that sentence that made any sense. I learned the rest of it over the following 3 weeks, mostly from a private investigator my father's legal team brought in the next morning, a retired detective named Marcus Delgado, who'd spent 17 years with the county sheriff's department before going independent. Delgado's report, later filed as Exhibit C in a civil complaint, laid it out in the flat, procedural language of someone who'd written 1,000 of these before. Chloe had, in fact, misplaced the ring herself 2 days prior, during a fitting, and rather than admit it to her new husband's family, who had purchased it, she'd allowed Amanda, in a panic, to borrow it back from a jewelry appraiser's safe, where it had actually been sitting the entire time for a last-minute resizing. The appraiser, a man named Simon Akwosa, who ran a small certification business 2 blocks from the Ashford Grand, confirmed under a signed affidavit that Chloe herself had dropped the ring off for resizing 4 days before the wedding and never picked it up. He had a receipt. He had a security log with her signature on it. He had, as it turned out, been trying to reach her by phone for 2 days to tell her the ring was ready, and she hadn't returned a single call. She had known where the ring was the entire time she was screaming at me in front of 200 guests. What none of us understood in the moment, what took the investigation another week to untangle, was why Chloe would rather publicly accuse her brother's pregnant wife of theft than simply admit to a fitting mishap. Delgado's report offered a theory, later corroborated by 2 of Chloe's own bridesmaids in signed statements. Chloe had spent 3 years building a narrative inside the family, one where I was beneath them, dishonest, a liability Dominic had been talked into marrying. Admitting she'd lost the ring herself would have been a minor embarrassment. Accusing me of stealing it in front of everyone, on her wedding day, would let her finish a story she'd been telling since the day we met. A story where I finally got exposed as exactly what she'd always claimed I was. She just hadn't accounted for the cameras, or for who actually owned them. Fiona froze the feed on the frame of Amanda pocketing the ring box and turned to the room. "I'd like everyone to remain seated," she said, calm in the specific way that lawyers are calm when they already know how a situation ends. "Ashford Grand Security has already contacted the police regarding an assault. Detective Renee Falk is en route." "You called the police," Eleanor said, and for the first time all night, her voice cracked with something other than contempt. "Over a family misunderstanding? Your daughter and you tore a pregnant woman's dress off her body in a public venue," Fiona said. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's battery, and depending on what the hospital finds when she's examined tonight, it may be worse." I hadn't thought about the baby in the chaos of the last 10 minutes. Hadn't let myself, because if I'd stopped to feel the fear underneath the anger, I don't know that I'd have stayed standing. But the word hospital cracked something open, and my hand went to my belly again, and for the first time that night my legs actually shook instead of just my hands. Curtis Okafor noticed before I said anything. "Ma'am, do you need to sit down? Do you need paramedics?" "I don't know," I said honestly, because I didn't. They had me sitting in a chair within seconds, someone's water glass pressed into my hand, Fiona crouched in front of me asking questions in a gentle, practiced voice that I later learned she used with trauma clients regularly. She'd spent 6 years before court corporate law doing pro bono work for a domestic violence clinic, which explained why she knew exactly how to talk to someone who just had her clothes torn off in front of a crowd. Detective Renee Falk arrived 14 minutes later. She'd been with the county police department for 12 years, the last 4 in a unit that handled domestic incidents and assault cases specifically, and she walked into that ballroom like she'd seen versions of this scene 100 times before, because she probably had. She took one look at the torn dress, the tablet still frozen on the security frame, and the crowd of 200 people who hadn't moved from their seats and said, "Okay, let's start with whoever has a phone recording, and then I want to see that footage from the beginning." It turned out 3 different guests had captured parts of the incident on their phones, unprompted, the way people do now, almost reflexively. Detective Falk collected all 3, along with the hotel's full internal feed, cataloged under a chain of custody log that Fiona's team had already started building before the police even arrived. I signed a statement. Amanda, visibly shaking, gave a statement of her own that contradicted Chloe's story within the first 2 sentences. Eleanor refused to give a statement at all, which Detective Falk noted out loud as exactly the kind of thing that tends to matter later. Dominic didn't give a statement either. He stood near the head table the entire time, arms crossed, watching his mother and sister get walked through a formal police interview in the same ballroom where they'd just eaten wedding cake. I want to tell you the crisis ended there, in that ballroom, with the truth on a screen and a detective taking notes. It didn't. That was just the moment the truth became undeniable. What came after took 5 more weeks and very nearly cost me something I hadn't expected to have on the table at all. 2 days after the wedding, I went into early labor. It started at 3:14 in the morning, a tightening low in my abdomen that I mistook at first for the same Braxton Hicks contractions I'd been having for 2 weeks. By 3:40, they were 4 minutes apart, and I knew, the way you just know, some animal part of your brain doing the math before the rest of you catches up, that this wasn't practice. I called my father before I called an ambulance, which in hindsight makes no sense, except that some habits form fast, and I'd apparently already decided he was the person I called when something was wrong. The doctors at St. Augustine Medical Center told me later that acute stress can trigger preterm labor, and while they couldn't say with certainty that the events at the wedding caused it, my OB, Dr. Priya Anand, no relation to the wedding planner, a coincidence that felt almost cruel in how ordinary it was, told me flatly that the timing was not something she'd call a coincidence in her professional opinion, not after 14 years delivering babies and watching what stress does to a body at 36 weeks. She said it gently, in a small consultation room with fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly gray, while a monitor beside my bed traced 2 overlapping heartbeats across a screen I couldn't stop staring at. I remember very little about the 2 hours between the ambulance and the delivery room with any clarity. It comes back to me now in pieces, disconnected, the way trauma tends to reorganize memory instead of storing it properly. I remember a nurse named Denise telling me to breathe through something that didn't feel breathable. I remember Dominic arriving at some point and standing near the door, uncertain whether he was allowed closer, and I remember not having the energy to decide the answer for him. I remember, more than anything, the specific quality of fear that has nothing rational underneath it. Not fear of pain, which I'd braced for, but fear that something happening to me 2 days earlier in a ballroom had reached forward in time and touched my daughter before she'd even taken a breath. My daughter was born 6 days early, 5 pounds, 2 ounces, healthy but small, and she spent 4 days in the NICU under observation that felt, to me, like 4 days of holding my breath. Dominic came to the hospital. He sat in the chair by my bed the first night and said, "I should have said something at the wedding. I know that. You should have," I said. "I didn't know how to go against them. I've never known how." I believe that was true. I also believe it stopped mattering to me somewhere around the 4th day, watching my daughter through an incubator glass while her father's family filed a police report against her mother for a crime that had never happened. We filed for divorce 11 weeks later, not because of one torn dress in the end, but because I'd spent 3 years married to a man who needed his family's approval more than he needed to protect his wife, and I finally had proof of exactly how far that would go. Proof, and a daughter, and a father who'd already sent his own attorney to make sure I never had to fight that battle without resources behind me. The civil case took 4 months to resolve.
Chloe and Eleanor were both charged with misdemeanor battery. Chloe additionally faced a charge of filing a false police report, since Ashford Grand Security had, in the 10 minutes before Detective Falk arrived, initially logged her accusation as a formal theft complaint.
Both women eventually pleaded to reduce charges. Eleanor to a single count of battery, Chloe to battery, and a civil settlement with Amanda, who'd hired her own attorney once it became clear she was being positioned as an accessory to a story that was entirely Chloe's making. Amanda testified against Chloe in the end, and I don't blame her for that. She was 24 years old and panicking over a ring that was never actually missing in the first place. Eleanor lost her position on the board of a local charity gala committee within a month, not because of any legal consequence, but because 200 guests had watched the incident happen live, and half of them had connections to the same social circles the gala relied on for donations. Word moves fast in rooms like that, faster, in some ways, than any courtroom. Dominic kept his job at the logistics company for another 8 months, until Sterling Hospitality's contract with them came up for renewal, and my father's board. Not my father personally. He stepped back from that decision entirely, which I only found out afterward, declined to renew based on an unrelated performance review that had apparently been sitting in a file for over a year. I don't know if that was coincidence or consequence, and my father never told me either way. I didn't ask. My daughter is 14 months old now. Her name is Rosalind, and she has my mother's eyes, which is a strange thing to say about a woman I never met, since my mother passed when I was 6. But my father says it every time he holds her, and I've learned to trust that he'd know. I moved back into a house 2 miles from my father's, close enough for Sunday dinners, far enough to feel like my own life. I went back to hospital social work part-time last spring. I still think, more often than I'd like to admit, about the moment Dominic looked at the floor instead of at me, not with the anger I expected to still be carrying, but with something closer to clarity. He chose. It just took me 3 years and a torn dress to understand that he'd been choosing the whole time. Quietly, in 100 small ways I'd talked myself out of noticing. I don't know what happened to the ring in the end. I assume Chloe eventually picked it up from Simon Okwuosa's shop, resized and cleaned, and wore it to whatever anniversary dinners she and her husband still have. I've never asked. It was never actually about the ring. It was about who a room decides to believe, and who gets to decide that back.